Since it began in 2001, the UFC Lightweight Championship has had a very unique history. In the past, when smaller weight classes were less interesting, the title was seen as a sideshow. However, it was the title that was at the center of the UFC's best-selling show ever. Some of the best fighters and biggest draws in the sport have competed in the lightweight division, but not many of them have won the title. Each of them has changed the history of the championship in their own way. But which champion is the best of all? Starting us off, two of the men on this list did not successfully defend their titles, but Sean Sherk is lower on the list than both of them. Charles Oliveira, who is the champion right now, is not on this list because he just won the title. That means there are 10 champions on this top 10 list, and Sean Sherk is right at home in this spot. Sherk beat Kenny Florian in a tournament for the empty title at UFC 64. He was the second champion in the history of the division. He even defended the title against Hermes Franca at UFC 73, but in late 2007, he was caught using anabolic steroids to cheat, and he lost the title. Getting caught for doping before there were USADA tests is something that no other fighter can say, but it will always hurt a champion's reputation. Eddie Alvarez had been called the king of the underground by MMA fans for a long time. Alvarez took the belt from Rafael dos Anjos at a UFC fight night in 2016 by knocking him out in the first round. But then there was Conor McGregor.
Could he finish him here? Conor McGregor is a UFC interim featherweight champion!
Alvarez seemed to have made it clear that he was the best lightweight fighter of all time. But in his first title defense, he got caught up in the Conor McGregor hype train. He wouldn't try for the title again, and now he's trying to find his place in one championship. Conor McGregor is one of the biggest UFC stars ever, but he isn't one of the best UFC fighters of all time. At UFC 205, the featherweight champion moved up to 155 pounds and knocked out Eddie Alvarez to become the first UFC fighter to win titles in two different weight classes. But that win was McGregor's last big moment in the cage. As Conor went to fight Floyd Mayweather, he would lose the featherweight title and be stripped of the lightweight title before making a single defense. Since his return to the UFC at UFC 229 against Khabib Nurmagomedov, Conor has lost all three of his lightweight fights. He's better than Alvarez because he beat him for the belt. Anthony Pettis became the UFC champion when he beat longtime rival Benson Henderson for the title at UFC 164 in his home state of Wisconsin. Before that, Pettis was a favorite on the internet. The UFC's marketing machine was all in on Pettis.
Man, that is a nasty, deep guard with some strong legs that are very fresh, and he's pulling on it there, and that's it.
And when he won the title, he became a superstar, at least for the time being. Pettis has always been a very dangerous fighter, but his time as champion didn't live up to the expectations. At UFC 181, he successfully defended the belt against Gilbert, but he would lose it to the man who comes next a few months later. Rafael dos Anjos is one of the UFC fighters who doesn't get enough credit. Many fans in 2021 might be surprised to learn that the current welterweight fighter was once the king of the lightweights. Dos Anjos got this title at UFC 185 when he beat Anthony Pettis with a unanimous decision after 5 rounds. Dos Anjos is better than Pettis for the same reason that Conor is better than Alvarez.
He's got the body triangle. He's got the body triangle. He's beating him up, and when Pettis goes to defend that,
However, RDA didn't have as much of an impact on culture as champions like Pettis and Conor. RDA successfully defended his title against Donald Cowboy Cerrone, a fighter who keeps getting better as he gets older, but he lost quickly to Alvarez. RDA could still try for another title, but it would be very hard for him to do so in the very tough welterweight division where he is now. In the history of the UFC, the first champions have gotten a bad name because they are thought to have had less competition or an easier path to the title. Even though that is true based on facts, Jens Pulver seems to have been an exception. Pulver is still thought of as one of the best lightweight fighters in history. Becoming the first UFC lightweight champion by beating Col Uno at UFC 30 was a big step towards cementing his place in history. At UFC 33 and UFC 35, Pulver would defend his belt against Dennis Hamilton and the return of BJ Penn. More on him in a minute. He would never lose his title because he left the UFC in 2002 due to a disagreement over over a contract. Benson Henderson was one of the most entertaining fighters in the history of his division. When he was in the UFC octagon, he brought out the best in his opponents. At UFC 144 in Japan, he won a unanimous decision and put an end to the reign of Frankie Edgar, who seemed unbeatable. Bendo would have a great run. He would defend the title 3 times, which would tie the record set by BJ Penn and Frankie Edgar for most defenses. In this run, he beat Frankie Edgar again, Nate Diaz, and Gilbert Melendez. But at UFC 164, an old rival, Anthony Pettis, tapped him out in the first round and took away his title. Frankie Edgar is one of the fighters who has done a lot to show that lighter weight classes can be successful in the UFC. At UFC 112, Edgar beat BJ Penn by unanimous decision and became the champion of the division. Edgar would go on to beat the former champion Penn again at UFC 118. He would then defend his title 3 times against Gray Maynard, with 2 wins and 1 draw. This is one of the best trilogies in the history of the sport. He lost the title to Benson Henderson, but he has since tried to win titles at both the featherweight and bantamweight weight classes.
Oh, he hurt him! Uppercut by Edgar! Edgar looking for the finish! Maynard's in trouble!
Edgar is a real beast and one of the best of all time. BJ Penn's fall from grace may have been one of the worst in UFC history, but he also had one of the best peaks. People focus on the 7 fights Penn lost in a row at the end of his career, but the prodigy got his name because he was a sensation nobody had seen before. Penn, who used to be the welterweight champion, won the lightweight title by using a rear naked choke to beat Joe Stevenson for the open title at UFC 80. Penn would defend his title successfully 3 times against Sean Shirk, Kenny Florian, and Diego Sanchez, all wins via stoppage. He would also dare Georges St. Pierre to accomplish in 2009 what Conor McGregor did in 2016. Penn lost his belt to Frankie Edgar and hasn't won a fight since 2010, but his time as champion was one of the best in the history of the division. But who is the most powerful? No matter what you think of Khabib Nurmagomedov, he has more titles than anyone else on this list. Khabib has also defended his title 3 times, which is tied for the most in the history of his division. However, all 3 times he faced very tough opponents. He won the title after beating Al La Quinta in Brooklyn at the controversial UFC 223. In his first defense of the title, he put an end to McGregor Mania at UFC 229. This was the best-selling UFC event ever. Then at UFC 242, he beat Dustin Poirier, who is now the #1 contender. On top of that, he beat Justin Gaethje, who had vaporized Tony Ferguson easily at UFC 254 and then retired. Khabib left the sport without losing a match.
Thank you. Today, I want to say it was my last fight. And no way I'm gonna come here without my father.
And he may have been the best lightweight champion ever.
Part of Charles tried to turn his back, but that only opened up a rear naked choke for Khabib Nurmagomedov, and it's game over.